Imagine it's the third week of the fourth quarter. Sales bookings are running slightly under forecast, and you need to ship every single unit if there's any hope of achieving the quarter's goals or even the year's goals. And then, without warning, the unimaginable happens. A critical supplier's plant burns to the ground, or perhaps one of your critical supplier's workforces goes out on strike, or maybe those containers from Asia sink at your local port, or perhaps it's a critical supplier's main machine that breaks down. All of these issues, all of these problems, all of these examples are inevitable. Somewhere in your life as a supply chain executive, one of these or more of these incidents is going to happen. Welcome to a Manufacturing Executive Institute Beyond the Basics series web session. Today's program is titled How Your Company Can Avoid the Impact of an Inevitable Catastrophic Supplier Failure. My name is Alan Dunn, and I'm president of GDI Consulting and Training Company and the founder of the Manufacturing Executive Institute. I've been an instructor at the California Institute of Technology's Center for Technology and Management Education for more than 32 years, teaching executives these kinds of issues. I've been vice president of Gemini Consulting, a partner at Coopers & Lybrand, president of a prior consulting firm that I sold to Coopers & Lybrand, the 2015 chairman of APIX, and I've spent over 30 years working on over 150 projects in over 20 countries, all in manufacturing and distribution companies. And today I want to talk about these catastrophic supplier problems. Today I'm talking about suppliers' failures that shut down your production lines. I'm talking about a supplier's delivery failure that can idle your company's resources. I'm talking about a supplier's quality failure that can result in just a boatload of returned product to your factory. I'm talking about a supplier failure that causes your company to not deliver products to your customers, and the result of that being lost shipments, revenue reduction in your company, higher costs, more inventory, and of course loss of reputation as a result of not delivering to your customers. My friends, I'm talking about your suppliers messing up your business. I'm talking about suppliers that can mess up your company's reputation. I'm talking about suppliers that can even mess up your career. You know, over the last 35 years, I've seen entire production lines idled. I've seen supply chain managers fired, dismissed as a result of catastrophic supplier failures that they thought were out of their control. You know, catastrophic supplier failure is, in fact, inevitable. It is certain to happen. It is unavoidable. It is a situation that cannot be avoided. It will happen sooner or later. So how do you change this inevitability? How do we move this inevitability and convert it from an inevitability to an improbability? Well, my friends, we're going to start by thinking and by taking this matter seriously. We have to take this matter seriously. If you want some proof about the potential bottom line devastation, I can surely show you some. Let's first talk about a study that was done by Georgia Tech Supply Chain Division. Kevin Hendricks, Associate Professor of Operations Management at the University of Western Ontario, teamed up with Vinod Singhal, Professor of Ops Management at Georgia Institute of Technology, to discover that when a company has significant catastrophic failure of just one supplier, that can lead to 7% lower sales growth, 11% higher cost of goods sold in subsequent years, 14% higher inventory, 10.5% decrease in stock value in the year following the disruption, and a lingering nearly 2% decrease in stock value the second year after the disruption. And worse for publicly traded companies, they see and documented over 13.5% greater stock price volatility when compared to the volatility in the years before the disruption. Catastrophic supply chain disruptions really can be devastating. If we need more evidence, all we need to do is talk about 5 companies in the last decade or two. And there's plenty more, but these are ones that really help to illustrate the problems. In 1995, Toyota's Kobe facility learned the problems of a major earthquake when their brake supplier couldn't provide the brakes because their facility was devastated by the Kobe earthquake. In 2002, Siemens had another problem when they discovered that they had a supplier with severe economic problems to the point where they couldn't even pay their suppliers. And so then they had to go to their second source supplier, who in fact could not ramp up fast enough. In 2000, Ericsson, the great multinational electronics manufacturing company, had a supplier who had a fire in their warehouse, and ultimately Ericsson lost $1 billion in sales as a result of not being able to ship product. In 2007, Ford Landstar had a supplier making chassis that effectively went bankrupt overnight, did not have enough cash to pay their suppliers, and in fact they had to bail out the supplier, and Ford Landstar actually had to buy them in order to solve the problem immediately. And then more recently, LuLuLemon Athletica in 2013 had supplier quality problems. LuLuLemon Athletica was a company that makes yoga apparel for men and women, mostly women, and they had a thread count failure, which resulted in the ability to see through these pants, and ultimately the customers returned them in droves, and that caused a lot of people at LuLuLemon Athletica their jobs as a result of not anticipating and not managing that catastrophic failure. In fact, look at what happened. Go back and take a look at January of 2014, or actually, I'm sorry, go back to 2013, and you can see in October 2013, the indication of the product failure started, and this is about stock price, but that's where it started. And then you can see the decrease in stock value of 50% value in stock price as a result of this supplier failure and this continuing supply chain failure. So what do you think happened to the supply chain manager? Look, these things really can happen and have happened, and we need to make sure they don't happen again. It's time to get serious about protecting your company from catastrophic supplier failure. Now, there's 3 desired outcomes we have from any critical global supplier. One is that we want our material delivered on time. Second is we want to receive material that meets our quality expectations. And 3, we want a supplier that over time, as our price points are forced to decrease in the marketplace, that our suppliers can help us out by reducing their price points. In other words, we need them to get more productive as well. What we don't need from a supplier is a surprise. Supply chain surprises are what cause materials managers, supply chain managers, and global procurement managers to lose their jobs and in some cases lose whole lines of business. So we see 2 mandatory solutions to solving this problem of potential for catastrophic supplier failure. And there's absolutely no reason why you can't begin to immediately implement these 2 solutions in your company. And why are these 2 solutions so important? These solutions I'm going to tell you about in a minute. It's because in a bill of material, the purchase items are always at the bottom of the bill of material. Purchase items exist at the bottom as D, E, F, G, H, and I in this illustration. And so anytime they're late, that creates risk for the items above. Because purchase items are at the bottom of the bill of material, their risk manifests in the risk of intermediate assemblies above, or intermediate mixes or ingredients, all the way up to the final product. You know, I always like to do this little exercise and ask the question, if all your purchase items, the purchase items in this case D, E, F, G, H, and I, are received on time 95% of the time, and quality acceptance of all those purchase items is 95%, You can see at the bottom under, say, item F, you can see the 95% times the 95%. Multiply those together, and that's going to give you the input probability of F going into B. Now, if your factory operates perfectly, then that means it's 100% on time. And then we ask the question, what's the probability of end item in this very simple bill of material being shipped on time? Well, the answer is 60%. So if item F has an input probability of 0.95 times 0.95, that means its probability is 0.91 going into B, but so is E and so is G. So 91% of 91% of 91% is 74% times 100% probability of B doing its job, and then C you have the same logic, and D you have the same logic as well. All that, as it rolls up, it means if your suppliers are 95% of the time on time and produce 95% quality, and your factory is perfect and never makes a mistake and never finishes a work order or a work authorization late, you still only have a 60% chance of shipping A on time. The results from an electronic manufacturing company survey that we did in 2010 are really devastating. We discovered that when 25% of orders to customers are late by more than 5 days, you can typically expect about a 6.5% increase in the annual purchase spend and a 28% increase in inventory as your associates try to buy their way out of the problem to never let that happen again. We're talking about the cash flow of the business going down, and we're talking about the assets of the business going up. You know, this is the simple valuation formula that we use when we look at any manufacturing company. How much cash flow can you throw off of the suite of gross assets? In the prior example, we threw 6.5% of our cash away. We created a cash flow deficit of 6.5%, and the gross assets went up 28% because the inventory went up. This is the definition of value deterioration. Cash flow is going down, the numerator is going down, the denominator is going up. The answer is going to be worse. So what are these two solutions that I suggested earlier in this presentation? Well, the first one is we have to find a way in our supply chain management arena to invent time. We have to focus our efforts on critical purchase items. Now, there may be other things to focus on, but we have to hugely focus on critical purchase items. And the second item is we have to avoid risk by executing proactive, formal supplier performance and risk assessments. Not phony assessments, not fake assessments, not boondoggle assessments to Asia or Europe or wherever we're going, but real accounting, CPA, due diligence, quality assessments. If you do just these two things, our experience tells us that you will reduce the probability of a supplier's catastrophic failure hurting your business by more than 90%. That catastrophic failure may still happen, but the damage to your business will be dramatically less. So let's talk about solution number one, which is how do we invent time? How do we focus only on critical purchase items? Why focus purchasing attention on critical items is a question that I'm often asked. We want to focus our attention on the important few because there's not enough time to manage all of your purchase parts. So we're going to manage only the important parts in your organization. We're going to separate the important few from the trivial many. You know, Vilfredo Pareto, who lived in 1848 to 1923, was a genius. He told us that 20% of our problems cause 80% of our expenses. He taught us that 20% of our inventory, if we apply it to inventory, accounts for 80% of our investment. We've discovered 20% of supervisors are behind 80% of grievances. So we're going to try to separate the trivial many from the important few. Question is how do we do this? How do we identify the 20% of critical items and critical suppliers and separate those from the trivial additional suppliers? How do we get rid of the noise? Well, we apply some rules of criticality. The first rule of criticality that we're going to talk about of the four is the length of the supplier's lead time. An item is going to be critical if it has a 52-week lead time versus an item that has a 2-week lead time. Length of lead time is one of the four determinants of criticality. The longer the lead time, the more critical the item is. The second determinant is supplier yield and quality variations. Suppliers who produce consistent quality are better than those who produce inconsistent quality. Now, here's the catch. You may only get good quality product from the supplier because the supplier, prior to shipping to you, sorted the good from the bad. And so, but the problem is that all goes into their cost structure. The bad goes into their cost structure. And if one day they get way more bad than good, that is a poor yield out of the process, there could be a delivery reliability problem to your company. So it's important to know the supplier's yield and quality variations at the supplier site, not at your receiving dock. The third determinant of criticality is about the availability of qualified alternate sources. A couple key words in there. Alternate simply means that you can buy the product, buy the ingredient, buy the component from a number of other sources. The more sources you can buy a component or an ingredient from, the less critical that item is. The other word in there is qualified. So it's not just being able to find an alternate source, it's being able to have a qualified source. Remember, in one of the prior examples, we talked about a company whose primary supplier failed. They went to a secondary supplier, and that supplier, while a great supplier, could not ramp up. So they were not fully qualified to produce product at the rate that their customer needed. And the fourth determinant of criticality are those things that impact the supplier. We refer to those as impactants. So impactants could be the supplier is located in the middle of the snow belt, say between Buffalo, New York, and St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. And so there's years, or rather days of the year, where simply it's hard to get trucks in and out. It could be a supplier located in a less than favorable country where there's potential for nationalization of factories and plants, or there's trade barriers. It could be all kinds of issues associated with that company, things that impact. We oftentimes refer to them as an environmental impact. It's not environmental in the terms of trees and rivers and the general environment, but the environment around the company that enhances or restricts its ability to provide product to you. Those four determinants are what determine the criticality of a component. Now, this is important that you put this note in your file. Component cost has nothing to do with component criticality. Let your chief financial officer know that you appreciate that he or she is really concerned about the cost of a component, but that has nothing to do with how critical it is in the bill of material supply chain. It's just an important and interesting fact that that item costs a lot of money, but it doesn't determine the criticality in terms of use within your internal or external supply chain. Has nothing to do with criticality. There's another note to your file that the volume that you purchase also has, interestingly enough, nothing to do with criticality. That no matter how much volume you purchase, that's an interesting fact, just like price, but it doesn't impact the lead time. It doesn't impact the ability to produce. It doesn't impact the ability to get the product through the supply chain. Once again, component volume, just like component price, have nothing to do with the criticality. So when you're trying to separate the few important components and suppliers to manage from the trivial ones, how much you spend and the volumes you purchase have nothing to do with the definition of criticality. I repeat, there are only 4 criticality determinants: length of supplier lead time, supplier yield and quality variations, availability of qualified alternate sources, and the supplier's impactance, those things that impact the supplier. So let's talk about a tool that we can use to evaluate the criticality of a component or the criticality of a supplier. So I want to introduce you to the component criticality matrix. So we are going to segment a component into one of these 4 groups. Either the component is low risk, you can buy it anywhere, it has short lead time, it's off the shelf, or it's high risk at the far other extreme, where there's only one supplier, one place, there's a lot of impactance, a lot of problems, etc., or manageable risk or risky. So those are the 4 categories we're going to segment these into. So let's do a little example here. So let's imagine that we want to take a look at the length of the lead time. Notice I just put to the left of the illustration, I put an axis, length of lead time, short at the bottom and long at the top. And then on the bottom axes, I put yield and quality variations, few on the left, many on the right, and we refer to these as the supplier-controlled variables. These are variables that are almost entirely in the control of the supplier. Now let's take a look at the right axis, and we call that the availability of alternate sources, few at the top and many at the bottom, the opposite of what a lot of people would think, but few at the top and many at the bottom, and now we do the top axes, the environmental impactance, the issues that impact the supplier's ability to be a reliable, quality-centric supplier. Few on the left, many on the right. So there's our 4 axes for this 2x2. These last 2 are referred to as the external variables. These are the variables the supplier has less control over, but you have more interest in. So while they may have less control, it doesn't mean that you aren't intrigued, that you aren't interested. So now you see the diamond that I just put in the left in the manageable risk. So I looked at a component, and on a scale of short to long, and you can set up the numeric scale the way you want. We do it differently in different companies depending upon whether they're process companies buying, say, powdered ingredients, or discrete companies buying, steel and textiles, etc. So the scales can change depending upon the environment. If you want more information about that, feel free to call us, and we'll be glad to talk to you about the different ways to scale each of these axes. But notice that red diamond suggests that the length of lead time on this particular component is reasonably long. That reasonably long would suggest some level of risk. And then notice at the bottom that we said that the quality variations are less than average. So there's still some quality variations and yield variations at the supplier, which means, by the way, you have to assess the supplier at the supplier. This isn't a hypothesis. This is fact-driven. You have to get out to the supplier. We'll talk more about this in the second point about the proactive risk assessment. But you have to get out there and find what we refer to as points of disruption, and then make a good, solid, educated assessment that says, in this case, that it's a little bit better than average. So there's moderate few yield and quality variations. Then we converge those 2 points, and notice they converge in the manageable risk quadrant. So if it's just about lead time and yield and quality variations, it's probably manageable. But since it's all the way to the right of manageable, it just is barely manageable. That's really what this means. So this is, if you had nothing else worse than this would definitely be a candidate for detailed analysis. But then we go over to the right side and we take a look at that same component and discover there are darn few alternate sources. And so that blue arrow goes kind of to the top of that axis. And then at the top, the environmental impactants are many, average many, more than average many, I should say. And then we converge those. And so you can see from an external variable perspective, things the supplier has a harder time controlling, it's a high risk. Then we do something statistically very unsound, but illustratively very important. We connect the two. And when you do that, you see the picture that this is mostly a high-risk component or ingredient. And so this particular ingredient is going to require a lot more management, a lot more attention. So let's talk about how to implement this now. So there's a number of ways to look at this from an implementation perspective. But first off, we have to understand that this whole idea of criticality identification is part of your purchasing strategy and database. Every item is identified as manageable, high risk, low risk, or risky. And periodically it gets reevaluated. So every single item has to go through this. We have to evaluate every purchase item in order to figure out which ones are the trivial many and which ones are the important few. We then are going to apply extra attention to the high-risk items, perhaps give them to our best buyers, our best planners, our best schedulers. And then on those high-risk ones, we're going to execute performance and risk assessments, only on the high-risk ones. And we'll talk more about that when we get to solution number 2. But that's the implementation requirements. Ultimately, what we're going to do is invent time by doing this. We are going to invent time by having you focus on those important few, the criticality, not driven by volume, not driven by unit price, but driven by the 4 determinants that I talked about. And seriously, folks, who doesn't want to invent more time? So let me give you this reminder. There's absolutely no reason why you cannot begin to immediately determine your critical items. As soon as you're done listening to this e-learning session, you should be able to go back and start identifying your critical items, and then invent a little bit more time for some more important issues. I would strongly suggest you don't delay on this, that you get started on this now and enjoy the time that you're going to invent from this criticality matrix. That takes us to solution number 2. Avoid risk. Execute proactive formal supplier performance and risk assessments. Really execute these. Execute them on those high-risk components that we just talked about. Supplier assessment is the equivalent of due diligence. Proactive and thorough due diligence of critical suppliers is now the new necessity in the global supply chain world, where distances are great, supplier complexities can be even greater, and the consequences of poor supply can be absolutely devastating to the bottom line. This is not a nice to have. This is a necessity. This is a mandate because of those 3 driving factors. It's usually at this time of the presentation, when I do this live, that I see the looks on some people's faces where they still don't believe me about the potential for bottom line devastation. Let me give you our greatest example of all, Mattel, circa 2007 to 2009, simply in 2 years period of time. Somewhere around July of 2007, they noticed that there was some paint, lead paint, on some of their toys. And that lead paint is a no-no. You cannot have toys that go to children that have lead paint. They did some recalls to recall all this stuff. They continued recalls even in January and beyond January of 2008. Now, I want you to notice that right before January of 2008 is December of 2007, which is Christmas, which you can see what happened. Well, you can't see it here because this is a stock price chart, but the volume dropped off because of the recalls. They kind of blew through Christmas of 2007 with some serious revenue decreases as a result of the recalls and the stopping of shipping. They also blew through Christmas of 2008, and then they ultimately even had a big settlement with their retailers, customers, and various regulators in 2009. Look at what happened to the stock price of this business. Oh my goodness, the stock price went from up in the $28+ range down to the sub $12 range. It went down to even slightly below $12. That's terrible. Careers cannot survive this magnitude of supplier failure, and probably shouldn't if you haven't done something proactively to solve these kinds of problems. Seriously, to everybody who's listening and watching this, how much more evidence do you need to be convinced that routine and formal supplier performance and risk assessments are now the new normal? Not the new nice to have, but the new normal. Well, there's 5 reasons, if you don't believe me yet, there's 5 reasons for this new normal. We talked about them briefly earlier, but I'll reiterate them and expand on them. First is that global suppliers are now farther away. So they're harder to manage, they're harder to visit, they're harder to see. These lead times are longer. Lead times because of the time on the ocean are longer. Just in time on both sides of the ocean have eliminated or had a tendency to eliminate buffers, which means that when there is a failure to deliver, that failure to deliver becomes catastrophic. Fourth, because of that JIT buffer elimination thinking, there's less inventory in the pipeline. And I don't mean just physical pipeline, I mean the metaphoric pipeline between supplier and customer. And when that pipeline starts to get dried up, or when we have fewer items in that pipeline, then the risk goes up. And you know, because of the language and the cultural issues, suppliers are getting harder to know. So we have to find a way to address this new normal. The new normal is going to require you to know as much about the workings in your critical global suppliers' factories as the suppliers themselves know. This is the epiphany you should be getting out of this presentation, that what goes on in your supplier's factory at a fairly low level of detail really is your business. A supplier is just a work center of your factory outside of your factory that you pay in a different way. You pay through a PO and a check versus through accumulations of labor, material, overhead expenses. Supplier agreements are only the beginning. Think of critical global suppliers as one of your work centers, just not physically in your factory. Try to think about if you went into that factory of your supplier and you looked for points of potential disruption, just like you do when you walk through your own factory. We call these POPDs, a point of potential disruption. You walk through and you see material blocking the access lanes to a machine so people can't get new product in or out. You see that as a point of potential disruption. You see a broken fork truck knowing that if I don't get that fixed, I can't deliver material where it needs to go. You see a failed electric circuit that doesn't allow a machine to run. You see water dripping from the ceiling as a result of a leak on the roof, and therefore you can't run the high voltage equipment underneath it. These are points of disruption you routinely see and routinely address in your own factory. But that doesn't mean your suppliers see them in their factories or address them in their factories. So you need to go into their factories with a methodology-driven evaluation process. You're going to do a supplier performance and risk assessment. By definition, a supplier performance and risk assessment is a structured process for factually identifying and evaluating your critical supplier's enterprise for points of potential disruption that can disrupt your supply chain and cause your company to fail with your company's customers. It's a methodology. What does this methodology do for me, for us? Well, once you understand the points of disruption in your supplier's factories, then you can imagine that, hey, maybe some terms and conditions on the supply agreement need to be changed. If you notice that one work center has a quality variation problem, you might suggest that the supplier has to keep an extra amount of safety stock of the material that comes to us. If you discover that the supplier is in Taiwan and your factory is in Canada, then you might imagine that hurricane seasons can create, or typhoon seasons can create some real problems. So you may want to have the supplier keep some extra inventory on our side or the Canadian side of the ocean. And so a performance and risk assessment is not about how to throw out a supplier from your supply base. It's about how to modify the terms and conditions in order to accommodate the risks provided by that supplier. It also provides an improvement path for the supplier, and it typically is modeled after due diligence from the mergers and acquisition world. So the same level of due diligence we do on finance and legal in the operational, or I'm sorry, the finance world, we now do in the operational and in the supply chain world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those high-risk items from our previous matrix that we went through in the earlier part of this presentation. I'm going to evaluate all those items to find those. I'm going to select those high risk, typically about 20%, and I'm going to execute a formal methodology-driven performance and risk assessment at that supplier site. So what are we looking for? When we do this due diligence of a supplier, when we do this performance and risk assessment, what are we looking for? Well, there's 12 mandatory elements of any performance and risk assessment. Then there's about 7 additional elements we may want to look at. But let's talk about the first 12. First, I need to evaluate a supplier's economic viability. My goodness, how many times have I gone into suppliers in my career or clients in my career, and they have a critical supplier, and yet they've never seen financial statements from that critical supplier. That's terrible. If you've got a critical supplier, you need to know their economic viability. You need to get information about how they perform. You need to understand their P&L and their balance sheet and their source and use of funds and their CapEx planning and expenditures. Number 2 is I need to understand the supplier's manufacturing or production processes, their methods, their tooling, their equipment, and their facility. I need to go into their factories and I need to look for those points of potential disruption. I need to notice that their forklift is broken, which means the material handling is unsure, which means that I may get some late deliveries. I need to take a look at the type of tooling, soft tooling or hard tooling. I need to understand their preventive maintenance system on their equipment and their facilities. I need to understand what the potential for a breakdown is or a catastrophic failure of equipment. Number 3, I need to understand how they measure quality and manage quality. Do they just sort the good from the bad at the end of the line and ship me the good? Incidentally, with the cost of the bad usually inside of it? Or do they use more progressive tools like statistical process control or failure effects modes analysis? What kind of tools do they use to manage the quality of their output? 4th, I want to take a look at how they do their own planning and scheduling, and I want to take a look at the type of planning and scheduling system. They use MRP or do they just use spreadsheets? Do they have an ERP system? How do they do this? 5, I want to take a look at how they manage inventory. I want to make sure that their inventory records are accurate in their finished goods warehouse, because if those are inaccurate, then that's a point of potential disruption to me. I also want to take a look at how they manage their purchasing organization. How do they get the best sources of supply at the best cost structure? I also want to see how will they integrate, number 7, with customers, including our company or us. I want to take a look at how they manage logistics, inbound freight, outbound, and by the way, the material handling in between, both intercompany and intracompany sort of material handling. On number 9, I want to look at their customer service capabilities, how they actually effectively deal with us, very closely aligned to item number 7. But this is about how they actually serve and support and provide empathy and help and assistance and technological assistance to their customers. I want to see if there's some technological superiority they have that we can use. Number 10, I want to evaluate the quality of the people that are involved in the leadership team and all those critical support teams that are important to get our product, their product to us, so we can make our product. I also, on number 11, want to see how do they do their supplier catastrophe planning, and how do they manage the risk of a factory burning down or data burning down. Those are the 2 typical categories of catastrophe planning that we look at. Is what happens if we lose information? Do we have it backed up somewhere? How fast can we get it? How fast can we be online? And what happens if the factory stops? What happens if there's a power outage? What happens if the factory, God forbid, burns down? And if you can do 1 through 11, then you ought to be in a position to understand their real cost, or we call the should cost. A should cost means that you've gone through, you've done your evaluations, you've done your assessments in a lot of areas in a fact-centric sort of way, and you know that their material costs are correct, but that their labor costs and their cost accounting system are incorrect. and that their burden rate is set incorrectly or their overhead rate for the factory is set incorrectly. And you can account for that, and you can accommodate that, and you can adjust for that, and you can figure out what products actually should cost to make in their factory. Once you do that and look back at the points of potential disruption and figure out what would happen if you got rid of those, then you can figure out what the could cost should be or could be. How much the savings could be found in this particular supplier if we partnered together. Now those are the mandated or mandatory 12 elements of a supplier performance and risk assessment, a true fact-driven assessment. But there may be other things we want to know as well. So for example, we may want to know something about their product and process engineering. And this goes back to that technological superiority that we want to tap into. We also want to look at how they can share information and the integrity and the accuracy of all of their information. We may want to know about their suppliers or their suppliers' capabilities. In other words, maybe there's something we need to know about how they manage their suppliers themselves. And then we also want to know about impacting supplier legal issues. Now, a lot of times we'll discover that on the upfront. Number one, when we look at their economic viability, we'll discover reserves and all kinds of economic adjustments for legal issues, and that'll give us insights. We'll look at past spending on legal issues, and we'll see that they have a tendency to be patent infringers, which is never good for us, because if you have a supplier who's a known patent infringer, then if they lose a case, it could shut off a line of supply to you. We want to know that in advance. If they've just been accused of patent infringement, it could be years, so you have time, which makes it a moderate risk. But if it's already been litigated and it's about ready to settle, then that may be a huge risk at this point in time. And then beyond that, we get to some really progressive perspectives, like look at how they manage people, their human resource issues. This is particularly important in some foreign suppliers in foreign countries to make sure they're not using slave labor, to make sure they're not using child labor, making sure they're a decent corporate citizen, number 18, and also looking at how they govern. Do they have robust corporate governance? We want to look at that as well, number 19. These are the characteristics that we look at, and then for each of those, we should be plotting those on this continuum of substantial risk to no risk. So I can actually have a moderate risk. That doesn't mean that that's a bad supplier. It just means it's a moderate risk, and there should be accommodating terms and conditions to deal with that risk that's derived from that particular supplier. So robustness of investigation, turns out, is critical. And this is the reason why you either have to engage companies like ours to do these formal structured performance and risk assessments, or train your people and provide the organization and the resources internally to do this. In other words, you need to do this. You can do this yourself, but you have to take it seriously. So for example, take number 5, looking at suppliers' inventory management capabilities. That isn't just walking through the warehouse. We would do an analysis of warehouse practices. We would do an analysis of their inventory management structure. We would do an analysis of planning parameters and how recently they've been updated and what their process is for keeping them accurate. That is, things like safety stock, order point, lot size, lead time, Kanban formulas. We would do an analysis of their inventory record accuracy, and we might even do a 3-year segmented inventory performance to be able to come back and say, from an inventory management performance and risk assessment perspective, we think this is a mild risk or a no risk or a huge risk. We had an example of one company we did this with, and their inventory record accuracy was around 68%. 68%. Do you understand what that means? That means that just a little bit more than half of the times we order, we're probably going to get the material. A little less than half the time, we're not going to get the material when we thought. There are 4 deliverables that should come out of every formal performance and risk assessment. This is the way we do it. Perhaps there's others for other people, but this is the way we do it. We first put together an executive summary going through the minimum 12 characteristics, and we talk about in this executive document, probably about 25 pages long, of each of those 12, what analysis we did and why we decided it was a mild risk or a huge risk or no risk. So we go through that, and that's just the executive summary. Book 2 is the economic analysis, looking at their financial statements, their P&Ls, their balance sheets, source and use of funds, CapEx, budgets, etc. We do an assessment on the risk assessment of this particular supplier. Now, the reason we keep this as a separate book is because obviously it's got economic information about a supplier in there. This is very confidential information and cannot be shared outside the company. All of these sort of assessments of suppliers, when we do them, all come with deep, legally binding non-disclosure agreements. And these NDAs require, in our case, and would require you, if you did it, to make sure that the economics are kept very confidential. Book 3 is the Comprehensive Supplier and Performance Risk Assessment Data Book. This is where all the data, so where Book 1 might be 25 pages long, Book 3 is the 350 pages of data. So if we looked at inventory assessment and we did 8 different routines or 8 different diagnostic activities or routines, this is where the results of all 8 of those would be. So you can see how we got to our ultimate opinion. And Book 4 is really not a book, it's more of a letter. It's going to find taking all those points of potential disruption, and when we do it, we ghostwrite a letter from the head of supply chain of our client to the head of supply chain in their organization and says, look, we love you, here's what we want to do, here's what we want in terms of new terms and conditions to accommodate these risks, and by the way, here's how we want to participate in helping you to release or reduce those POPDs and how we're going to share in the benefits of that. So Book 4 is really the communication to the supplier that says, here's what we have to change with our relationship, and here's how we would like to partner with you. All of these books ultimately result in a composite performance and risk assessment about this supplier is a moderate risk. So we may, in Book 1, where we go through the 12 minimum characteristics, and we rate each of those individually, then we build a composite to identify that particular supplier for that particular component. So in summary, these kinds of assessments, they're proactive and they're quantifying, and they provide clear evidence of a global supplier's strengths, weaknesses, and cost reduction opportunities. This gives us better information to negotiate, or better information throughout the document, but it helps us to negotiate better prices and better terms and conditions, which should result in reduced spending, improved risk profiles, and improved supply chain efficiencies. The final deliverable includes unambiguous risk mitigating recommendations for specific modification to the terms and conditions that should be applied to purchasing agreements between your company and the global supplier. That's what this is all about. Companies don't hire us to do performance and risk assessments if they want to get rid of a supplier, because it costs money to do these. They pay us for the 2 to 3 weeks it takes to do each one of these. No, instead, what they do is they use these assessments to help them develop a new set of terms and conditions that accommodate those risks and help to drive the supplier to reduce or eliminate those risks. People always ask me, well, gee, Alan, how much does this cost? And in this particular program, I'm not going to talk about the cost and what we charge, because I'm really unbiased. Whether you engage our company to do these, or you engage us to teach you how to do them, or you do them yourselves, I really want you to really understand the cost of not doing this. Can your company really afford poor material delivery reliability? Can you really afford poor received material quality? And can you really afford increased total material cost? Those are the big issues that I think you need to deal with. Can you imagine a global supply chain world with minimum surprises? Can you imagine what that's like? So with that, I want to leave you with reminder number 2. Again, there's absolutely no reason why you can't begin to immediately build your supplier performance and risk assessment processes. Whether you engage us, whether you build your own processes, there's no reason why you can't start immediately on these. So there you have it. You have two new mandates. The first is to focus only on critical purchase items through the use of the component criticality matrix, and the second is to execute formal supplier performance and risk assessments. We suggest you get started now. Don't delay. You know, the cash flow over gross assets equation reminds us that if we can reduce risk, we can improve performance, we can in fact improve the cash flow, maybe even off of a suite of gross assets that's even smaller. We should be able to increase our cash flow by not having surprises. We should be able to decrease our gross assets, in particular our inventory, by not having surprises. And that's what creates an increased enterprise value. And seriously, people, who doesn't like increased valuation? Thank you for attending another MEI Beyond the Basics Series e-learning program. Today's sponsor and producer has been the Manufacturing Executive Institute, located in Corona, California. If you have any additional training needs, please call us at www.mfgexecutive.com. To learn more about how GDI can assist your company to evaluate supplier performance and risks, contact GDI's Supplier Assessment Practice at 951-736-2114 or email Alan Dunn directly at agdunn@gdiconsult.com.